There is a strip of sand on the northwestern edge of the Black Sea that has been deciding the fate of empires for nearly 250 years. It is barely wide enough to park two cars side by side at its narrowest point. It has no cities, industries, or natural resources worth mentioning. And yet every major empire that has ever tried to control the Black Sea has understood that whoever holds this sandbar holds the key to everything north of it. Putin understood it too, which is why, in the early weeks of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russian forces seized the Kinburn Spit and held it for 4 years as the westernmost anchor of Russia's military grip on southern Ukraine. From that position, Russia pointed its guns at the mouth of the Dnipro River and blocked every vessel trying to reach the ports of Mykolaiv and Kherson. Over 100 ships sat frozen in Mykolaiv harbor. 16 million tons of grain that used to move through that port every year stopped moving. And to signal that this was a permanent arrangement, Russian forces named one of their fortified positions on the Spit Suvorov Monument, after the general who had defended this same ground for Catherine the Great. The name was deliberate. It said, "We are the heirs of empire and we are not leaving." For 4 years, every attempt of Ukraine to dislodge Russia failed. Commando raids, precision drone strikes, and constant pressure, none of it was enough to break Moscow's hold on the Kinburn Spit. Until June 25, 2026, when a Ukrainian flag went up on that sandbar. On June 25th, Ukraine's Southern Defense Forces released a video showing a blue and yellow flag flying from a rooftop on the Kinburn Spit. Independent geolocation confirmed the flag's position at the eastern edge of the sandbar, just where the narrow section of the spit begins. The unit credited with the operation was the 801st Special Marine Detachment, Ukraine's combat divers, an elite formation that carries a history with this part of the world so personal it borders on poetic. The 801st was originally based in Sevastopol, the very city Putin made the home of his Black Sea fleet. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, 73 of the unit's 80 personnel defected to Russia or stayed behind. 7 came back. 7 men rebuilt the unit from almost nothing in Odessa, and now, 12 years later, that same formation was raising Ukraine's flag on ground Russia had held since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. It should have been one of the most straightforward victory moments of this war, except for what Ukraine's own military said within hours of publishing that footage. Dmytro Pletenchuk, the Ukrainian Navy's official spokesperson, spoke to journalists the same day. His words were careful and precise. Yes, Russian troops had been forced to abandon some of their positions, but the Spit was still a combat zone. Russian forces remained in the area, and the territory could not be considered liberated until the foot of an infantryman sets foot there. Deep State, the independent military tracking organization that has built its reputation on refusing to overstate Ukrainian gains, went further. Its analysts said they could not confirm a full Russian withdrawal, that Russian units appeared to still hold positions on the Spit, and that the flag itself may have been delivered to that rooftop by drone rather than planted by soldiers physically standing on the ground. So Ukraine published a video of a flag, and then, within the same news cycle, its own spokesperson said that the flag did not mean what it appeared to mean. That is not the behavior of a military trying to spin a marginal development into something bigger. That is the behavior of an institution being deliberately honest about the gap between a symbolic moment and a completed military operation. And that honesty actually makes what happened here more interesting, not less, because it forces the right question. If Ukraine didn't simply overpower Russia, why did Moscow abandon a position it had defended for 4 years? The answer didn't begin on June 25th. It began 17 days earlier, inside a Russian military document. The Kinburn Spit was held by the 337th Guards Air Assault Regiment, one of Russia's elite VDV airborne units. These weren't ordinary troops. They were professional paratroopers trained for some of the military's toughest missions, the same type of force that spearheaded the assault on Hostomel Airport in the opening hours of the invasion. Hostomel failed, but it showed the role these units were meant to play, and for 4 years, that same caliber of soldiers turned the Kinburn Spit into one of Russia's strongest positions on the Black Sea. They didn't lose the Kinburn Spit in battle. There was no Ukrainian amphibious assault across the 4 kilometers of open water separating the Spit from the city of Ochakiv. There was no dramatic final push against Russian defensive lines, no combat footage of Ukrainian troops clearing trenches under fire. What happened was slower, quieter, and in many ways more devastating than any battle could have been. The ammunition stopped arriving. The fuel stopped arriving. The food stopped arriving. And at some point, the gap between what a regiment needs to function and what Russia's supply system was actually delivering became impossible to close. and the command made the decision to evacuate whoever was left. Ukraine's southern defense forces announced that sustained fire strikes had forced Russian troops to retreat, adding 4 words that reveal everything. Evacuation of surviving personnel is underway. After 4 years on the Kinburn Spit, Russia's elite paratroopers weren't driven out by a direct assault. They were forced to abandon a position that could no longer be supplied. That single word, surviving, tells you more about what actually happened at Kinburn than any of the footage. And it raises a question that goes far beyond this particular strip of sand. Because if Ukraine can force Russia's best troops off a fortified position simply by cutting what feeds them, the question isn't whether this method works. The question is where it gets applied next. No one is breaking down this war with this level of depth and detail. If you don't want to miss the next analysis, hit subscribe and stay with us. On June 8th, 17 days before the Ukrainian flag appeared, a report emerged from inside Russia's own military headquarters. Published by the UNTOUCHABLE partisan network, it came from a source inside Russia's Dnieper group of forces. It was something closer to a death notice for Kinburn garrison. The report said ammunition was no longer getting through, neither was fuel or food. Ukrainian drone strikes had disrupted the supply route, leaving the troops increasingly cut off. The fire teams stationed on the Spit to shoot down incoming Ukrainian drones were taking casualties they could not replace. After part of the 337th Regiment was redeployed to the Zaporizhzhia sector to plug gaps elsewhere along the front, the soldiers remaining on the Spit were severely undermanned and, in the source's precise language, had not received a single reinforcement, even once. The command's response to all of this was to shuffle whatever soldiers remained between positions, moving men from one gap to another in what the agent described as an attempt to patch a situation that was already beyond patching. The report concluded that only scattered remnants of units were left and they were no longer capable of maintaining an effective defense. To understand why Russia couldn't fix this, because the Kinburn Spit has a logistics problem baked into its physical shape. There is only one way to supply it overland, and that is through Kherson Oblast, via a narrow land corridor that runs directly through territory where Ukraine's middle strike drones had been systematically hunting Russian military convoys for months. The same campaign that had been severing supply lines to Crimea, the campaign documented across the previous weeks of strikes on highways, fuel depots, and ferry crossings, was simultaneously cutting the single thread feeding the paratroopers on the Spit. And because water surrounds the position on 3 sides, there was no detour available, no alternative route to fall back on when the main corridor became too dangerous to use. When Ukraine made that road too costly, the garrison supply situation didn't slow down, it stopped. Southern Defense Forces spokesperson Colonel Vladislav Voloshin confirmed the picture in precise terms. He said, "The command of the 36th Army has imposed limits on the use of artillery shells because logistical routes are under the control of the defense forces of Ukraine." Russia's own formation commander had been forced to ration ammunition because Ukraine controlled the roads that delivered it. And when you are rationing shells on an exposed position surrounded by water, with no reinforcements coming and food no longer arriving, the question is not whether you will leave, the question is only when. But here is what makes all of this genuinely significant beyond the Kinburn Spit itself, and it is the part worth sitting with for a moment. Defense Minister Fedorov formalized Ukraine's approach to exactly this kind of operation on May 27th when he announced the Logistics Lockdown Program, a dedicated $113 million investment specifically designed to scale middle-range drone strikes against Russian rear supply lines across the entire southern theater. The announcement came with data that should have alarmed every Russian commander reading it. Russian battlefield losses per square kilometer of territorial advance had nearly tripled in the preceding months, rising from 67 soldiers killed per square kilometer in October to 179 by April. The more Ukraine cut the roads, the more it cost Russia to hold anything along them. Kinburn was not an accident or an opportunistic strike on a weak point. It was the first visible result of a program deliberately designed to produce exactly this outcome, and the people running that program had already identified the next positions on the list. Fedorov connected the logic plainly. A clear pattern is already visible on the dashboard. The more Russian logistics are destroyed, the fewer assaults occur on the front line. Russia's offensive capacity and its supply capacity are running on the same fuel. Drain one, and the other bleeds out automatically. What happened to the 337th VDV on Kinburn was not a local failure caused by bad luck or poor positioning. It was a proof of concept. And the question that proof raises is not whether Ukraine can do this again. It is whether Russia has any answer to it at all, Because the tool that emptied Kinburn is not a conventional weapon. It is not something you can match with more men or more artillery. And the way it works is the kind of thing that makes the traditional calculus of this war look like it belongs to a completely different century. The weapon that starved Russia's paratroopers is not a missile system or a piece of Western military hardware. What emptied Kinburn was a kill chain, a connected sequence of human intelligence, autonomous strike systems, and on-the-ground degradation that operated simultaneously across 3 layers. And understanding how those layers work together is understanding something important about how this war has fundamentally changed. The first layer was human, and it was operating from the most unexpected location imaginable. The Atesh Partisan Network's agent was not watching Russian supply convoys from a hillside with binoculars. The source was embedded inside the headquarters of Russia's Dnipro group of forces, the command structure responsible for the entire sector. From that position, the agent could observe not just what was happening on the front line, but what Russia's own commanders knew, what decisions they were making, and crucially, what they were choosing not to do. The intelligence flowing out of that headquarters told Ukraine's drone operators exactly which supply routes to prioritize, which positions were most dependent on the corridors being cut, and how close the garrison was to the breaking point. You cannot design a more precise targeting system than one built on the enemy's own command decisions, and Atesh was feeding exactly that kind of intelligence into Ukraine's operational planning in real time. The second layer was the Middle Strike drone campaign itself, and the formation most associated with this campaign carries an origin story that is worth understanding because it tells you something about how Ukraine built this capability from almost nothing. The 414th Unmanned Systems Brigade, known publicly as Magyar's Birds, is now regarded as Ukraine's most effective large-scale drone formation. In October 2022, its commander, Robert Magyar Brovdy, started with approximately half a dozen men and a collection of commercial Mavic drones he purchased from his own pocket. There was no government allocation, no military procurement process, no formal unit structure. A businessman from Uzhgorod bought consumer drones and started flying combat missions. By 2026, the formation that began with those personal credit card purchases was conducting thousands of combat missions every 24 hours across a massive stretch of occupied southern Ukraine, hitting military vehicles, fuel tankers, cargo trucks, rail junctions, and logistics depots with a precision and tempo that no conventional military unit could have matched at the same cost. The daily sortie count across all Ukrainian unmanned systems forces middle strike units had reached somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 combat missions every 24 hours, with at least a third of those concentrated in the corridor between southern Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and Crimea. The highest priority targets were military vehicles, fuel tankers, and cargo trucks, exactly the category of asset that a garrison on an isolated sandbar depends on for survival. And the rate was not steady, it was accelerating. French OSINT analyst Clément Mollin tracked the strike rate independently and documented roughly 500 Russian vehicles destroyed in a 48-day window, with the pace reaching approximately 30 strikes per day by mid-June. His own assessment was unambiguous. The campaign was not slowing down despite Russian attempts to adapt, it was intensifying. The third layer was perhaps the most technically decisive, and it happened on the Spit itself months before the flag went up. In May 2025, the 801st Combat Divers conducted an operation to locate and destroy Russia's newest anti-drone jamming system deployed on the Kinburn Spit. The system was specifically designed to suppress Ukrainian FPV drone attacks by disrupting the video feed and control signal that drone operators depend on. It was Russia's answer to the drone problem, the technology that was supposed to make the Spit defensible against the kind of campaign Ukraine was running. The 801st found it and destroyed it. With the jammer gone, every drone flying toward the Spit's supply lines and defensive positions could reach its target without interference. Ukraine hadn't just cut the supply line feeding the garrison, it had first stripped away the defensive capability Russia had placed there to protect itself, and then cut the supply line. What makes this such a nightmare for Russia is the cost. Drones costing just a few $1,000s crippled the supply chain supporting an elite VDV regiment worth tens of millions in training and equipment. Russia couldn't keep up. Ukraine identified weak points, struck them, and adapted faster than Russia could replace its losses. In January 2026 alone, The 412th Ukrainian drone brigade, known as Nemesis, had destroyed an estimated $250 million in Russian air defense systems. That is 1 month, 1 brigade, $250 million in losses that Russia's sanctioned defense industry cannot replace on any reasonable timeline. Russia's response to the drone campaign targeting its convoys on the southern highways revealed how little it understood about the nature of what it was facing. Mobile fire teams were deployed to escort fuel tankers, Russian pickup trucks with mounted guns accompanying convoys carrying supplies to the front. The strike rate accelerated anyway. Military trucks were repainted white to resemble civilian vehicles. Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance documented the moment military equipment was loaded onto those trucks at the depot and tracked them from the point of origin. The disguise was pointless because Ukraine wasn't finding the trucks by their color. It was finding them by watching where they started. A Ukrainian commander in the 413th Regiment summarized the fundamental problem Russia cannot solve through any of these adaptations. He said, "Because it's a scarce resource, it's very expensive, and even if they just throw a sack of dollars at the manufacturer, air defense won't just materialize because there's no microchip." Ukraine was destroying equipment faster than Russia could rebuild it. That is exactly what happened at Kinburn. Intelligence exposed the weak point. Drones cut the supply route. The isolated garrison ran out of options and withdrew, and Kinburn is only the beginning. Listen carefully. This spit matters not because of what sits on it, but because of what lies behind it. The Dnipro estuary, the waterway that the spit guards at its mouth, connects the Black Sea to the port cities of Mykolaiv and Kherson. Every vessel traveling to or from those ports must pass through the narrow channel between the spit and the Ukrainian-held city of UNTOUCHABLE, 4 kilometers of open water that Russia turned into a permanent kill zone the moment its troops dug into the sandbar. With artillery, anti-ship missiles, radar, and electronic warfare all pointing at that channel, the answer for any Ukrainian or commercial vessel trying to pass was simply no. The door was closed, and Russia held it closed for 4 years. The scale of what that closure cost is not abstract. The Mykolaiv port complex handled 30 million tons of total cargo in 2021, including up to 16 million tons of grain, making it one of the largest maritime export hubs in the entire country. Before the invasion, Mykolaiv alone accounted for roughly 35% of Ukraine's food exports. The company Nibulon, one of Ukraine's largest grain producers, shipped nearly 6 million tons annually through routes that ran directly past the Kinburn Spit. Over 100 vessels, ranging from private boats to large cargo ships, have sat stranded in Mykolaiv harbor since 2022, unable to move in either direction. The man who built that grain export infrastructure was Oleksiy Vadatursky, Nibulon's founder. Russia murdered him in a targeted missile strike on his home in Mykolaiv on July 30, 2022. Zelensky called it a great loss. The company Vadatursky spent decades building was rebuilt around his absence by the people he left behind. And today, his team says they are technically ready to resume operations and can begin loading ships within 90 minutes of the first vessel mooring at the terminal. The infrastructure works. The port works. The only thing that has been preventing it from functioning is the gun Russia pointed at the door from a sandbar 4 kilometers wide. Removing that gun does not immediately reopen Mykolaiv. Russian forces still hold the eastern bank of the Dnipro, and as long as they do, the broader navigation picture remains complicated. That counterargument is real and should not be dismissed, but it removes the most direct threat to vessels attempting to use the estuary, and it changes what is possible in ways that extend well beyond shipping lanes. Because Kinburn was on the peace negotiating table, during the April 2025 Paris talks, U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff specifically discussed the return of the Kinburn Spit to Ukrainian control as part of the American peace proposal, framing it as something Washington could offer Ukraine in exchange for accepting significant territorial concessions elsewhere. Witkoff put the logic plainly in a May 2026 interview. How is Ukraine going to access the water and get their goods to the marketplace? The Spit's return was the American answer to that question, a concession Russia would make so that Ukraine could at least export its grain. Ukraine just took it by force. The item that American diplomacy was preparing to offer as a negotiated concession no longer exists as a concession. It exists as a fact on the ground that Ukraine established without asking anyone's permission. And that changes the diplomatic map in ways that will take time to fully understand. but are already impossible to ignore. The Southern Defense Forces did not simply announce a flag, they announced a direction. We are not stopping. One day our tanks will reach Jankoy. Jankoy is the railway junction in northern Crimea that controls every major supply route feeding the peninsula. It is the node where the land bridge and Crimea's internal rail network converge, the single most important logistics point between the Russian mainland and the 60,000 troops garrisoned on the peninsula. The unit that just starved Russia's paratroopers off the Kinburn Spit is pointing at Crimea's supply heart as the next destination. And given what just happened on the Spit, that statement deserves to be taken seriously in a way it might not have been a month ago. But there is an important distinction to make. Kinburn and Crimea are not the same. The Kinburn Spit was defended by a single, isolated regiment with one vulnerable supply route. Crimea, by contrast, is protected by tens of thousands of troops, multiple supply lines, and enormous political importance for the Kremlin. That is why some analysts urge caution. Military analyst Tor Buchvoll says it is still unclear whether Ukraine will permanently hold the Spit or whether it will become a contested no-man's land. Military observer Alexander Kovalenko also warns that the withdrawal could prove to be a temporary rotation rather than a permanent abandonment. The Ukrainian flag is significant, but by itself, it does not settle those questions. But here is what the counter-argument cannot explain away. The method that emptied Kinburn scales. It is not dependent on a unique geography or a particularly weak opponent. It is dependent on cutting supply lines faster than they can be repaired, degrading defensive capability before striking, and sustaining the tempo until holding becomes more expensive than leaving. That formula worked on Russia's elite paratroopers on a fortified sandbar. It is already being applied across the entire southern corridor at increasing intensity. And Russia's own internal signals tell the story that official statements will not. The Kremlin state pollster quietly stopped publishing Putin's real approval rating after it fell below 30%. The military bloggers who built their audiences by celebrating Russian advances are now writing about kill zones and dead ends in language that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Prominent Russian war correspondent Alexander Kotz, one of the most visible supporters of the military campaign, summarized the situation in the south in terms that required no interpretation. Crimea has been left without petrol, electricity, and water. The position Russia named after Suvorov is now flying a Ukrainian flag. The unit Russia reduced to 7 people rebuilt itself and planted itself there. And the declaration that came with that flag was not a celebration. It was a statement of operational intent from a force that has now demonstrated it can make fortified positions untenable without ever directly assaulting them. Russia came to the Kinburn Spit to stay. It named a fort after an imperial general to say so. It is leaving because a supply truck couldn't get through. And the question now hanging over every exposed Russian position in the south is a simple one. Which garrison runs out of food next? This is the Frontline show. If you want to see why Russians are now fleeing Crimea in record numbers and what it means for the war, click the video on your screen.